Welcome to our virtual Breachpoint event. We are graced with the presence of John Thomas today. John, it's excellent to have you online for this. We've had you on our podcast before, and I've had the pleasure of speaking to you. But you're coming back in a little bit of a different capacity today, sharing what you know around the US market entry, what it looks like for Australian founders in defence, what's some of the things that they might come up against, things they should know, things that we do well, things that we don't do well. You are the person at the forefront of that, and you've seen it time and time again. But if you wouldn't mind giving us an introduction to who you are and what you're doing now, because last time we spoke on the podcast, you were doing something different and with a different organisation, and now you're wearing a new hat. So I'd love to hear about that.
Sure. Appreciate that. Yeah, I always start my introduction as I'm a recovering Capitol Hill staffer. I spent 12 years on Capitol Hill as the chief of staff for two members of Congress, political systems, doing armed services appropriations work. So working with probably hundreds of U.S. companies, kind of seeking funding, non-dilutive funding from the government to help build out RDT&E projects or procurement projects or MILCON projects, things like that. After that, 7 years in law firm. As Peta was mentioning, my last time I was on the pod was last year when I was at the Pillsbury law firm working with a very, very impressive law firm doing kind of market entry work, ITAR, EAR, VCE work, government contracts work. But my role in that was a senior policy advisor helping build out the national security practice. And so we represented international companies, we represented startup companies, we represented kind of mid-sized companies. And then since then, like many of you, I took the entrepreneurial bug and was like, I need to do my own thing. So I found a partner and we are building out what is called Frontera Group. It's kind of focused on startup companies. I do represent a couple of mid-sized companies, but we focus on connecting with the capital allocators, like the good folks at Bean Zone Ventures and others across the U.S. ecosystem, as well as kind of walking through kind of doing business development in the Pentagon and doing the congressional work for seeking appropriations and or policy language in the National Defense Authorization Act. As you may have seen, Congress is not as functional at all times here in the United States, but things do get done eventually. And it's just being in the room when you want to start competing with kind of the big guys and some of the medium guys. But there's been a big push in the recent years with investments in small defense companies to start doing lobbying on the Hill early. And so that's kind of where we target. We represent about 24 companies doing that right now. So hope that's
It is. No, it's a great snapshot. And I've heard it many times from our friends in the States, the level of effort that goes into, like you said, lobbying on the Hill and what that actually does. It's something we do see it here, but it's definitely more, it's definitely a focus for people like yourselves in the States. And that is what actually shifts change or encourages change and enables things to move along and happen, which is amazing. And when you reference capital allocators, now we are a venture capital firm. Alongside venture capital firms, who are the other capital allocators?
Yeah, so you can think of it as that's kind of a broad term that I use to kind of encapsulate a bunch of folks. So you have your VCs, your private equity, you have your family firms, and then on the government side, they have some non-dilutive things called like SBIRs, small business investment research funds, STTR, which are partnerships with universities. They have direct grants and direct contracts to OTAs, other transactional authorities, or outside of DFAR. There's a lot of different allocators, but the focus of a lot of companies that I've seen come over is the main impediment to them because they're as an early started company. Before you get that first big contract, it's how long can you survive until you get to that point. So I made it a focus to make sure that we were networking with the entire defense venture world so that when companies come over, I have several backed firms that I can introduce them to that if they do want to decide to do the lobbying because there's some expense related to that they have the actual capital to maintain themselves. And maybe we're not the first people that they hire, we may be number two, because really what you want to focus on is customer development at the very beginning. And so that may mean you just need, if you're an Australian company, that may mean you just need to hire like a business development person in the United States to start building those contacts as then you start to move over because it gets into some other legal things I can get into, but I'm not a lawyer. Let me put that at the beginning. I do not practice law, so I cannot check that. But there are some things that you need to think about on FOCI mitigation, U.S. corporate structure. Where do you need to set up your company in the United States? How does that look? Where is the customer located? A lot of small decisions that go into that as you start to bring yourself over here to the U.S.
There is not one episode of either our Breachpoint webinars or the podcast, in fact, where we haven't mentioned the importance of being on the ground in the States. And you mentioned they're hiring a business development manager. We push for the founders or someone on the founding team or definitely one of the executives to base themselves in the States. Where have you ever seen it work where there is not a body placed or based in the States for for an Australia-based company?
Where have I seen it work? I do know of
Have
a
you seen it
company.
work? Have people
I
just
have seen it
successfully?
work where what I will always say that what's most successful in the US is persistent presence. And so what presence does that take? The CEO is the most important presence in the US. But if you don't have that, have someone who has that same kind of level of involvement and connections that can leverage that. I don't know if you want me to name names, but I can. There's several Australian companies that have been successful in coming. The CEO comes over for some of the major conference events, but then they have someone on the ground who used to work in Australian government in the US that is then has those connections, that is
Mm,
on the ground day to day working around the United States and allows for that kind of connection so that when they come together, it's a really powerful combination.
yes.
And they've been successful and not just the goal may not be to be the company that stands up and you're the sole thing and you're probably going to get into this, but sometimes you need to work with US companies and partner with US companies to actually get to that next level. So sometimes it's who's the prime or who is the subprime that my technology connects best with, that if I can utilize, and then I can leverage their BD teams for what we're doing as opposed, and that reduces the amount of capital that I need to expend in the US to actually get to that next level.
Yeah. Excellent advice, and definitely something that echoes what is usually shared as the best way forward. I like the way that you mentioned there a persistent presence, because there is, let's face it, sometimes if it's a smaller founding team, the ability for people to pick up and move their entire life over there, sometimes it's not a no, but maybe it's a not yet. There has got to be ways to engage in like persistently, to still be front of mind, to still build those connections and build those relationships without permanently being based there. And I like the way that you framed persistent presence. The US are big fans of attending conferences. You host a lot of them. We just shared before we press record how many you are personally going to. That persistent presence piece, can we talk about that? How do we show up? Where do they go? How do they keep being front of mind and plug themselves in to the right networks?
Yeah, it's kind of like just mapping out everything is on a cycle everywhere. So in the United States, Congress lives on a cycle, the program offices live on a cycle. PPB&E was the plans, program budgets and execution in the Department of War. It's how they plan out the POM for the 5 years. And there's always a time and a place for it to be present. So the US and the Army has 2 annual conferences per year. So if you're working with the US Army, if that's your target customer, they have AOC Huntsville in Huntsville, Alabama, usually in the spring. And in October is AUSA Global Forces in Washington, D.C. Same thing with Air Force. They have 2 conferences per year. There's AFCEA. But effectively, you kind of want to pick, you know that you're going to have all your customers kind of in one place. That's kind of how I view it. It's like, where are they going to be? And a conference is not necessarily this end point. It's also, you can request for meetings there, but it's about the meetings that happen after that. That's the initial conversation. You want to go there to schedule the next meeting. That should not be the first one or the last one. That should be just the first one on to the next 2 or 3. You can also leverage. I'm a big fan of Austrade and the Austrade team that I work with here in DC. Their job is to help you actually make those connections as well. They put delegations together for Sierra Space, for AUSA. You can be part of a delegation that comes over. They do pre-meetings about a week before with some of the senior leadership in the Pentagon. And then they have events and then receptions as well as that. But effectively, that's great so long as they carry that on down the road. So how do you do that? And that goes back to the first point about how do I have a maintained presence here and then build those connections and leveraging the spirit behind AUKUS, which is continually being developed on Pillar 2, particularly there's an appetite for Australian technology. And there's an appetite also for US companies to work with Australian companies in Australia as we kind of build out capacity there as well. So how do you find that? And some of that is finding the right partners in the US to make that happen.
And there he
Hey,
is,
Sean.
just right on time. Sean, welcome, and letting everybody else know So Sean Singleton is our US venture partner. And I was mentioning, Sean, that you have this way of magically appearing halfway through a podcast. You're always dialing in from somewhere exciting. So I like it, whether it's at an interesting conference. John said last time we were on a podcast together. You dropped in from a conference. So where are you dialing in from today?
Dialing in from Washington, D.C. Just had a wonderful dinner with a person who's coming out with a new book about the innovation ecosystem that is a part of the PayPal mafia. So that'll be for a subsequent conversation. And John, thank you so much for blessing us with your presence.
My pleasure, Sean. Always.
Sean, so far, and for everyone else, I know we keep getting people joining us along the way. So thank you for joining those who had technical difficulties with the link. This will be recorded. So if you missed anything in the beginning, you can absolutely go back and watch the recording. John has shared different ways that we can be persistent, have a presence, who you need to talk to, how to stay front of mind. And there's lots of really good, interesting tips there that are very valuable. I'm just going to go to the question section here. Finlay has asked, what's the best pathway for a small Australian defence startup with a novel technology to break into the US market and get in front of US VCs? Now, that's a really big question, very broad. And first, Finlay, I'd say go and listen to every podcast we've ever recorded and every previous episode of this. There's tips there, but I'd love to hear your insight, John.
Sure. We get this. I do get this question a lot, in fact, from Australian companies, which is exactly that. How do they, when we say novel technology? So the thing that I always look at is you're looking for a gap in US capability. And how do you define that? That's looking at sort of the budget. This gets into a little more detail, but getting into the J books and seeing where funding is going, seeing what programs of record exist, what capabilities out there. I'd actually take a look at LinkedIn as what people are posting about what they're doing technology-wise. And are you novel in a sense that it's something that doesn't exist today? Is it related to a critical technology that the U.S. Department of War is looking at, that they've identified 6 technology areas? If it's something in that, then you have an opportunity. You're probably, depending on where you are, looking at RDT&E funding, depending on if it's novel and new, it probably requires more development. So there are programs in the U.S. that SBIR, though you have to be a U.S. company to apply for a SBIR. So to do that first step is actually very simple to set up a U.S. corporation. That's not an expensive process. I'm no longer at Pillsbury, so I won't say that you don't have to go through a law firm, but it is helpful. But once you get that established, then you can apply for that. As long as you're in the U.S. and you have a U.S. team, that is one way to develop it further. For the US VCs, many of them are open, and that's kind of one of the things that I'm actually trying to develop more here in the U.S. is more interest in Australian companies from the venture capital world. And so a lot of them are interested if you have, and they'll kind of look at the same thing because they'll do their due diligence on your technology. They'll ask their friends in the department, is this something that you are interested in? And if it is something, they may be interested in meeting with you. A lot of times you can just reach out over LinkedIn, reach out directly, find a point of contact. You can happily email myself. I can point you in some of those directions and kind of show you some of the folks that might be interested, but it's really about what that technology is. Is there a gap in the US market for it? Or is it is it something that can be utilized in a cohesive way between the US and Australia as far as integration? I'd be interested to hear about that. But the best way is just to ask. Like many things in life, that's how I operate. I just ask hey, can I meet with you? Yes. Can we do this? Yes. But bringing that forward, it's really just, I feel free. One of the things I did, I don't know if this is helpful, but I used LinkedIn to reach out to dozens of VCs to ask for meetings. And I got meetings with them just to introduce our group. When I was at Pillsbury, our group here at Frontera Group. And since then, and they're more than willing to meet with you if you just ask the question. So I would just recommend just reaching out and asking for a meeting.
It's great advice. And so, John, question as a follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
What we frequently say at Beaten Zone is that the Department of War and the intelligence community buys the best technology, it can get on contract. And if you don't get on contract, it doesn't matter. To that end, one of the things that we advocate that a lot of Australian founders do is to try to find a systems integrator or a collaboration partner to actually help them get on contract. So that's one mechanism. And then also, too, the Department of War doesn't buy piece parts because they don't in themselves integrate. So if you are going to go ahead and try to sell it to the Department of Defense with a novel technology, trying to find a collaboration partner who can actually package it into a comprehensive solution might be a much faster and smarter way of actually getting, effects on target. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Because the U.S. Department buys platforms. They don't buy pieces. So you're going to have to work with the U.S. integrator. It all depends on what it is. And if you're in the cyber world, that's different. If you're doing those kinds of operation maintenance services, that's a little bit different. But if you're a piece or you're something that goes on a platform and or requires be integration, because everything is about integration into the services, they do not and to Sean's point, one of the things that they're working on right now is, let's say you do have something that you can offer, If you can't scale it and deliver it in a short time frame, they're not interested. Really, and even that's something, to Sean's point, that's something that DIU does, because when Defense Innovation Unit puts out a commercial service offering, that's for something that can be deployed very rapidly. And sometimes they will partner you with other companies and say, put this all together into one kind of cohesive thing that then we'll go then deploy it. You may not be the one, we're going to put you one of many and actually put the best capability forward. And the other thing you want to have is, if you're working with a system integrator, you want to make sure they're working with the department that you want to work with. So if you want to work with the Army, look for the integrators that work with the Army. I actually represent a large systems integrator right now on the IT logistics side. So I'm helping them identify companies for mergers and acquisition that brings them in. So that's how they actually work. And some of these corporate venture funds, CVCs, are actually good for that as well. Because if you talk to them, they're working for the large primes. So you have Lockheed Martin Ventures. There's actually Stellantis Ventures that's looking for automotive technology that can be a dual use. So if you get into a commercial aspect, that's something else to consider. Commercial buyer, that then you become dual use, because then you actually have a base. And what the department's also interested in is, are you a going concern? It's another way of saying, are you commercially viable and not dependent on the Department of War for your contracting? So that's actually a benefit if you're an Australian company that already has a business in Australia that's working, that then you have that backbone when you go into the US, that you have time to actually get onto a contract from that point. Well, before the current administration, you were looking at like a 5-year cycle or like a 2-year cycle. Like it was a long tail to get into a government contract. Even if you're working with a system integrator, you are a sub to them. You're not their priority. That said, the department has been making efforts and changes in acquisition reform and moving to scale and making OTAs a preferential contracting vehicle moving forward. And when I say that's other transaction authority, that simply means less requirements than the current federal acquisition regulation system on a contract. So they can move faster, but they can also take more IP. So there's these things that happen in this. So they are trying to move faster so one of the things that's happening right now is they're utilizing a method of getting to sole source contracting authority by doing gauntlets, by doing exercises. So basically doing a competition as opposed to a paper competition. They're actually doing a competition where they'll take the drone dominance program. So they down selected to who was going to get an award. You had 2 months to get there, perform, and if you got it, you got an award that day. So they're on certain programs, they will move very rapidly to do that. On other larger platform programs, that's not the case. But the focus has been to bring in a lot of smaller companies as rapidly as possible to expand the defense industrial base, to the point where they just delayed CMMC2 requirements, because that was a big problem for these companies to get these cybersecurity third-party validations on different things. I heard this at a number of industry days. So I wasn't surprised when Kristen Davies came out and the Small Business Administrator came out and said, we're delaying this by at least 60 days. There's a pause. I won't say it's over, but there's a pause.
Spot
Yeah,
on.
good.
Spot on. Sorry.
Go, Sean.
No, just building on the OTA piece, John, could you elaborate a little bit on the collaborative combat aircraft, the Anduril, General Atomics, Kratos, and what that means, right? So a lot of people here in the States will say you can't do certain things on OTAs, right? The reality is that the United States wouldn't have ever gotten to the moon if it wasn't for OTAs, which started with NASA and allowed us to even build the Saturn V rocket. So you can build large-scale platforms that actually scale out. So can you talk how there seems to be a little bit of a change of mind building on what you just wonderfully articulated within the department?
Sure. It's been a frustration in Congress for many, many years on speed to relevant. Well, I would say speed to acquisition. So that when we were talking before about that long contracting cycle process that usually took about 5 years to get something, or 2 years to get something actually on contract, OTAs have existed for a long time. That is the basis of consortiums. And consortiums were also created to be this place where you could have OTA contracts and a small group of companies or 50 companies that compete on that's not noticed, or you have to be a member of that consortium. The authority has allowed for these large projects that want to move very rapidly to happen. So to Sean's point, these big projects in the past were created because Congress was frustrated by the US's own regulations on acquisition. So how many checks do you have to do? All these different, it was taking way too long. So if they want to build something fast, they put it under OTA. That kind of gives you an idea of how quickly do you want to move something? What is the contracting vehicle that they're using to do that? If they do otherwise, they're not as interested. It's almost like a telltale sign of like, what is it that we want to move rapidly and what do we not? And I kind of alluded to this at the beginning. The Trump administration has made OTAs by executive order the preferred acquisition vehicle for the departments. They've been trying to do federal acquisition regulation system reform. So FARs reform. That's been an effort of the administration as well to get that down to a much simpler process. But the other issue is we're talking about Department of War right now. Every federal agency has their own version of federal acquisition regulations to them. That doesn't necessarily matter for this context, but that is kind of the reality of every agency wants to buy it the way they want to buy it. I would say the Department of War is moving much faster than everyone else as to how we need to do this because in reality, we are fighting a war in Iran right now. We are fighting, or a conflict, I should say, depending on where I'm at, fighting a conflict in Iran. And we are we're in a race. We're in a race in AI. We're in a race in space. We're in a race in all these different areas. So we can't let, I say we, can't let our own regulations slow us down. So there is an effort to make that as quickly as possible. So you're seeing all these different kind of, you did a DIU down select, therefore you're eligible for a sole source over here in this Army PIT program. You already competed over here. We're not going to replicate a competition. We're going to use that same results here and make you eligible here for the SBIR award. So you're starting to see these machinations happen in real time. And I'm trying my best to keep up with them as everyone else is and try to keep that informed as best I can on LinkedIn. That's kind of how I keep things as updated as I can.
So that was going to be one of my questions is how do we find out what's going on, who's running like these various competitions or initiatives that you can get involved with. But and then I'm going to hit two of the questions that have popped up here in the chat. So is a good place to find out what's happening. You're sharing it on your LinkedIn regularly. Anywhere else that people could be looking to find out what some of these initiatives that they might be able to get involved in?
Sure. Each of the innovation organizations have both a LinkedIn and an email, and a subscription service for things. I would track what I did. There are a couple of things you can do. One, LinkedIn, follow SoftWorks, AppWorks, follow all the innovation organizations because they put out when the exercises are happening. I'll pitch another platform that I use called Mission Cultivate, which some of my friends have built that is also working with across the different services to post within that app where things are happening and when they're doing it. Army PIT, DIU puts out their stuff on LinkedIn. There's all sorts of places. The services are doing a lot more effort to get the notifications out there. The other thing is sign up for SAM.gov and create searches and like industry days, exercises, all that stuff by federal regulations required to be noticed. So they will notice when things are happening and you kind of have to be tracking that. If you're not tracking that or have a system that tracks that, or you're not following them on LinkedIn or not signed up for their email services, you're going to miss that because each of these things has a deadline. Usually white papers have to be submitted by a certain date. You have to sign up by a certain date. And if you don't, you're out. It's as simple as that. They're moving that fast.
Great insight. And I know that you've mentioned a couple of times and you speak highly of Austrade. And I think everyone else has mentioned the same thing as being across what they're doing at any given point in time as well and what events that they might be involved in. I'm going to run to Brian's question here and read it out for you. With technology needing to cross the ITAR and EAR boundaries to support an AUKUS and NATO event, what would be your expectations? What would be your expectations be for a cost and timeline?
Yeah, so ITAR and EAR boundaries some of those were helped out by the AUKUS agreement that you can get some ITAR relief on that for things that are traveling back and forth between the US and Australia. The timelines as long as you're if you have a US presence and you are doing an exercise, it's just the cost associated with doing the exercise. For ITAR, you don't become ITAR controlled until the US buys your system or they've identified it as a system in the US or IP in the US that they want to protect. The benefit of being an Australian company is that the strong relationship between that means that the ease of licensing, if you're going to sell outside of the US, if you develop that IP in the US and then want to sell outside the US, it's actually just getting a license. Costs of that are dependent on the law firms or the services that you utilize to go after that license. And if you have a person that's a compliance person in an organization, or if you're partnering with a US prime, I would leverage their teams to actually do that licensing work for you. So you can reduce your costs depending on how you structured your exercise and or who you're teaming with in the US to do that. I don't want to say, I don't know the exact cost of the license. I could say it can range, but anything's like how much you put into it if you need to do it. Maybe Sean has some experience in that. But I know that for a law firm, it's just based on billable hours and how long it takes them to actually get that done. And that can probably range from the probably 10,000 to 20,000 range typically in the law firms in the US.
And the only thing I would just add to that is that it depends on the law firm. Actually, one of our portfolio companies, we had a conversation yesterday with a very prominent law firm, and not to sort of tip the hand, but they may do some things just sort of pro bono or gratis because they want the relationship, right? They see something in the company, they see something in the capability to where they're willing to sacrifice something up front for the long-term M&A relationship or the long-term IPO, something along those lines. And they can be a huge force multiplier for a company if they're intrigued by the founder and the vision that the founder has for the company.
Thanks, Sean. We've got another question from Finlay here, and it does relate to working with potential partners and primes. Is how do I protect my IP while engaging with prime contractors during early partnership discussions?
Put it in writing. That's basically what it comes down to, because it's really contract negotiation. And you have to really pay attention to prior art and things like that as to what you are protecting. Mostly in these relationships, your base IP is what you're protecting. What's being developed beyond that is what's being negotiated. So always negotiate protections for IP in your contract negotiations. And if you need help with that, I do highly recommend you engage with an IP attorney or a government contracts attorney at a firm in the US that can help you with that.
And make sure it's a very strong firm with past performance like John or somebody along those lines, because you get what you pay for. And the thing about it is, though, you want your counsel to be better than their counsel, because that's what it really boils down to, is that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good
And the
advice.
government will say that they're not trying to take your IP and they say they won't share it, but just buyer beware kind of thing. So,
Well, John, you bring up an excellent point. These are people that have never been in the private sector, so they don't know, right? Even if you're dealing with a systems integrator, a lot of times those are former military folks, and they don't understand how detrimental it can be to actually have that intellectual property or trade secret taken away from a company.
yeah, because that's the value of the company. The value of the company is the IP.
I've asked this question and I've had lots of different versions of the answer. John, when companies do come over, you've explained what needs to happen, how they can possibly plug in and build those early relationships, maybe assess how long it's going to take them to do that, how you have to have enough capital to last. There are some key things there that cultural differences between Australia and US, there are definitely some differences there that Aussie founders need to learn and understand how to operate with the US partners and entities. What is some really straightforward feedback that you can give to people to key things that we do that aren't great, or things that we do that are really well received in the States?
I will say one of the things I've experienced is that the US prefers US companies.
So how can we navigate around that if we're an Aussie company?
Yeah, if you're an Aussie company, it's how do you become a US company? And there's a strong relationship that exists between Australia and the US that I think that you have the benefit of that. Other countries don't have the benefit of that kind of relationship. I've ran into this more with Israeli companies than Australian companies as far as a bias towards a system. But most that's based on trust. So there's a lot of trust between the US and Australia on bringing those systems over. Two things I've seen work have to do with mostly the willingness to work with US primes and getting into their systems. Haven't seen I've seen one. There's a company that's doing passive radar systems in the US. It's an Australian company that has won contracts with the Marine Corps and other services that they just built it out, but they built it out by having the US CEO, a US CEO, and then building that presence out and then working those relationships and being near the Pentagon in the Virginia area for building that company out. So they've actually been very successful. I've seen another company, a maritime autonomous company, work with Leidos, work with some other US primes, also try to partner with smaller companies and then go after other innovation things. Most of the things that work is when you pivot to something that's really going to work for what you're doing. And sometimes it's when you're stuck, kind of this is what we do. But sometimes when you meet that other partner, you need to make a pivot. And that pivot is usually where there's success. Let me think of some others. Been working with a cloud company when I was at the when I was at the Pillsbury law firm on a secret cloud. And it's really what they did was they had to build out, both do their FOCI, the FCL, get the security clearance, get the proxy board, set up the USEO. It's a very involved process, but they've been making great progress in building out both a UK, Australian, and they have an Australian company, very strong one, a US company and a UK company to build a cloud for AUKUS. I think I'm very bullish on them on what they're doing, but they weren't in the startup world. They're more of the mid-sized, larger size Australian company that was then working in. And then I know that there's an OSINT company based in Charlottesville, that open source intelligence, company, Australian company that has built out this very strong US presence and has done very well. I see them at a lot of defense conferences and other things. But the way they did it, it's like this, it's the same method that most companies have to do. They just have to be present, have the relationships, and maintain those relationships over time, find the contracting vehicles, find the right consultants, build out the right presence, and then have the capital behind them to actually make it happen. So it's harder for the startups to do that. It's easier, always easier for the mid-size and the large companies to do that instead of presence. The focus of today on the startup world is find the right consultants, find the right partners, get into the right network, because as many of us find, you see the same people once you start getting into the ecosystem all the time, and everyone wants to help each other. So it's like how do we raise all boats is we help each other actually get to that next level and get to that actually contract, because the value death is very real. It's mostly related to, can you actually last that long till you get to that first contract and then basically build off that? And then how do you build a bigger company beyond that?
Sean, do you have anything else to add to what John was saying there?
No, the only thing I would just add is that it's nice to be able to go to these conferences and see John and other familiar faces, because it is truly a circuit, right? If you actually look at the US dual use defense tech ecosystem, and John, I could be off by a couple of dozens, but it's about 600 of us, and we all know each other. And we're all trying to make sure that this ecosystem doesn't actually pop into a bubble. And so it all really is incumbent upon us working together and really truly getting the US government, and by extension, the Australian government, to be a better customer and give a clearly delineated demand signal. We don't need a lot of capital from the governments. We just need to know, if we solve your problem, that you will buy it and buy it at scale. If you can do that, the private and the public capital markets will come in and fill that void. So, John, anything else you wanted to add on that point?
No, that's absolutely right. It's the demand signal. There's been machinations of this in the UAS world where the US marketplace, a US marketplace that the PO Aviation was putting together earlier last year, an Amazon system, but they were talking about buying like 10 systems at a time. But if you're a company building US, like, okay, we're only selling 10, it's about scale. And so to Sean's point, we need greater direction on scalable purchases from the department. And that's growing. They've recognized that. And so you're starting to see that come along. But yeah, it's clear demand signal. And as Sean said, that ecosystem is where you actually hear what that demand signal is. Who's buying? Who do we need to connect with? What's the actual program? How do we fit into that program? And who are the people that we need to meet?
Absolutely. And this is by far the most venture-friendly administration probably in the history of America. So when you look
Absolutely.
at Deputy Secretary of War Feinberg, who ran Cerberus, he has so many lieutenants that are actually sort of going back and forth between the Pentagon and in private industry, of trying to figure out what's the best capability that exists out there and bringing it into the men and women in uniform. So
Yeah, I will say sometimes we like to say they buy the best capability, but sometimes they buy what's available right now, and or it's a relationship.
Mm.
It's a relationship. The colonel knows you, or I think I said this last time. Generals make general decisions, majors make major decisions. Who is the actual buyer? Who has the authority, and who's the contracting officer? And what relationship do we have with them? Because if you have that, sometimes it's like I worked in politics, so this is the background I come from. But it's sometimes it's not always the best, but that's what we strive for. We strive for the best, but the reality is it's a competition.
Mm.
And in competition, you have to be present, you have to be running, you have to be racing, you have to be at the front and always there, and they have to know who you are. If they don't know who you are, you're going to have a very hard time being, purchased down the road.
It goes back to your persistent presence comment you said, I think, in the first sentence that we had the discussion. There's a great question that's coming from David. If you have multiple maturing technologies, is it better to focus on one technology at a time for US entry, or go in as a broader entity with multiple capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would take a look at each of those technologies and see what the actual demand signal is in the US for that particular technology. It is not to say I would actually recommend starting with your best one that has the most chance of success. That's not to say that you can't bring the other ones over, but oftentimes I've been in these pitch sessions where someone's pitching a technology that they want, and then they start selling the other ones that they're not as interested in. It's sort of like pick the best one as a test case, bring that over, see how that works. And if you have demand signal for the other technologies, start to bring those over. But oftentimes it's going to be one or two or three that they actually want to move forward with and not the broad scale. DIU, to our example before, you may be really good at this and okay at that. We're going to take the really good piece of that and move forward with that. We'll come back to you later because we might want to pair up you with somebody else to take that second capability that's better with someone that's less over here. So it's like the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle. It's like go after the 80% of what's successful.
When you were talking before around having the capital to survive, the long playing the game, literally got to go and play the game, plug into the network, show up, be persistent, all the while they're needing to generate revenue, stay alive. Now, in the event somebody had a contract here in Australia that might not have been defense specific, could have been more dual use, but they're doing that to survive, to stay in the game, would that be seen as detrimental to what their perception of their focus on, that if they're not being seen to be focused on defense, if they're maintaining a business here in Australia that was in another sector?
No, that's not a bad thing. Actually, I think I mentioned the department and a lot of folks prefer that there's a commercial capability first. Like if you have a commercial capability first, that shows us that you can actually run a business, that you can be viable, and that your dual use capability that can potentially transfer over to a military application is not contingent on success on that military application for the viability of the business. So I actually prefer in some ways if you have a commercial capability that we're then making a military variant of it because there's a supply chain. And this is the other piece of this. There's actually a supply chain exists right now for you to build that.
The only thing I would just build on with John's statements, right, is that, Western Australia has a lot of great metals and mining capability. That's a directly adjacent domain to a lot of what the Department of War is doing here in the States. So if you're doing autonomy on behalf of BHP Billington, right, you actually have a capability that the Department of War probably might care about, right? And the fact that you have them as a logo on your slide deck, that's only going to enhance your credibility, especially with organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit. Because again, the business model, putting my DIU hat back on, we wanted to see commercially viable entities that weren't wedded to the Department of War, because we wanted to stay away from was just basically the research and engineering shops. We wanted to actually work with going concerns that actually had aspirations of becoming unicorns. So
I like to touch on that critical mining and minerals piece because I do represent high purity iron manufacturing company in Conroe, Texas. That's actually, we're looking at moving a plant to Australia for this reason. The other thing is that the industrial based policy side, and it's something else that Australian companies can take advantage of building out capacity. If you have a technology that is, well, let me just say it. If China is the prime manufacturer of a technology and you can manufacture that in the US or Australia, there's IBAS, industrial based analysis sustainment is not limited to US companies. So that is another vehicle, particularly in the mines and minerals piece. If you're developing rare earth minerals and or things that can be processed into military capabilities, the U.S. is actually interested in investing directly in Australia or directly in other countries to build out manufacturing capacity there. So I do also work with the industrial based policy teams. So I do work on large manufacturing projects in the United States. And that's actually looking for capability, manufacturing capability, and or other technologies that are dominant in China or dominant in our adversaries that can be produced in the US. So they do have funds, significant funds available to set up manufacturing facilities as well, if that's something that the company wants to do, or if they have a technology that requires manufacturing. Does that manufacturing exist in the US? Does it not? And this gets into NDA compliance. That's something else that you're going to have to think about when you come to the US and start producing something. Your supply chain needs to be domestic. It needs to be US and or Australian. And it really cannot be any parts or components coming from China moving forward. So partnerships, that gets back to the partnership side, is if I have a product that I'm manufacturing or I'm going to start selling to the US Department of War, I have to think about my supply chain. Where does the supply chain come from? Who do I need to partner with within the US that has that ecosystem? Does the manufacturing exist in the US? If it doesn't, is that something that I could create in the United States?
And so manufacturing in the United States, John, getting back to your home state, can you talk a little bit about choosing the right place in the states, right? So I often say that the states are 50 shades of awesome, 50 shades of crazy. Could you talk about the states that are probably in the top 5, top 10 of places where Australian founders should look to build operations?
Sure. You can, one, I would start with where do you want to live? That's one. Two, to Sean's point, where is going to be the best support for your company? And where is from the congressional political side, where's the political support moving forward for where they're going to seek out? If you then go to seek appropriations and or policy, where are the best states to do that? To Sean's point, Oklahoma is a great state to do that. There's a lot of Armed Services Committee members. I look at the political laydown of where Alabama currently has a chairman of the Armed Services Committee. They're a long time. Space Force is moving down to Huntsville. Texas, the entire Austin, Dallas, Houston ecosystem is very supportive. I will say, I don't know if I can say it on here, but I'm going to say it, stay out of California. It's not going to be helpful to you from a tax perspective. Great state, great ecosystem, great folks. Silicon Valley.
You can always visit. You can always visit.
You can always visit. But you have low tax states like Florida and Texas that don't charge state tax. Once you start getting into the site location, there's a whole lot of different things you have to consider. Political is one of them. Where you want to have your employees, do they want to live there? I'd say I won't say there's no wrong state, but there's a lot of right states to choose for where the ecosystem exists. And you kind of want to build yourself around that ecosystem, get involved in that. So there's very strong ones. There are strong ones in Silicon Valley, San Francisco. There's definitely a strong San Francisco, Palo Alto, depending on what you're doing. If you're in the cybersecurity AI to the CA thing, there's AstraMechanica is based in San Francisco. There's all these companies, ecosystems that are out there. Austin has a very strong ecosystem. Tampa, if you're in the SOCOM world, you want to be around that. You want to be down in Tampa, Florida world. And then you can never go wrong with Virginia and Maryland just for the whole entire defense ecosystem where your customers are actually located. But I would also look at where is my customer? Detroit, if you're doing ground vehicles. Oklahoma, if you're doing fires. That's the missiles and different things like, I can't think.
Kinetics.
Thank you. Kinetic weapon systems, howitzers, those kinds of things. But yeah, that's a conversation to have, kind of like, and there are companies, by the way, that I've met at Sierra Space and Airspace Cyber, startup companies that will literally using AI systems break down entirely workforce, political support, customers, all those things for very cheap can actually do a whole laydown of what states. And then there's a Select USA is a conference in the US if you really want to deep dive into states and economic development organizations that will vie for I would actually recommend picking a few and then talking to their economic development teams and having them, they will work against each other and compete for your business. So they'll tax incentives, grants, other.
There's one question here that Jake asked, and I think it ties into exactly this point. Definitely a point. What would you say is the biggest mistake or trip up that you've seen Aussie founders make when trying to break into the US DOW market? I know that Sean has talked about this a lot in terms of location being a big part of that. What other things would you see as Aussies founders tripping up on?
I would say bringing a capability that already exists in the US or not understanding how important it is to find a partner when something already exists. We all like to think, this is what I run into. I like to think I have a novel idea, but I really need to test that idea, test it and see, is there an actual market? And I think the mistake some folks do is they bring a capability where there's a flood of companies in the US that have that same kind of technology. And then you're competing with US firms and you really have to stand out if you're going to do that. How difficult it is. I think that's actually the other part of this is it's not an easy path, but it's like high risk, high reward. If you can get in and you can get to contract and you are the right type of company, you have a much higher, almost no ceiling on what you can accomplish in the US as far as access and market. The other thing is also defense spending is based on an annual appropriation and it does have a cap. It is a pie that is divided. There are pockets that are available, but it's not as though you're going to be a billion-dollar company that supplants Anduril or supplants Palantir or supplants something else. It's expectation, I think, is another thing of what can you actually expect to achieve in a year and 2 years and 3 years. And so understanding that and having measured expectations based on advice, and that when you get to talking in those conferences, you get to talking for those folks. If you don't have an idea, go to a conference, go to an industry day, get an idea, talk to a lot of people, stress test what you actually think you can achieve, and then go from there.
And I think that we hear a lot that it is difficult, but then also on the flip side of that, it's very doable. Difficult,
It's
but
very doable.
doable. There is a game. It's a strategic game. It's all about following that yellow brick road of pathways, programs, conferences, plugging into the networks, meeting the right people, consistent, being visible, and then also ensuring you've got runway enough to last that piece of the puzzle. And then once you're getting in, of course, you've got to be able to deliver on the back of that with the right products and the right team to deliver. But it's not doable, and there's lots of people doing it. We just need to probably break down more of the barriers to what people are perceiving to be a barrier. I don't think there are barriers. I think maybe it's
Not
about
really.
let's find the information. This is the whole purpose of these types of conversations. So is
Absolutely.
there anything that you wanted to close off on there? Advice for founders, what your summary is, John, and same with you, Sean.
Sure. My advice is don't discount. I always say think big. Like, what is the art of possible? And if you have a novel technology, if you have an innovative technology, show it. Bring it and show it to the as many people as you can. See who bites. We say you have to kiss a lot of frogs to find your prince. Sometimes, even when you are working through the process, you're going to meet a lot of people. It's just getting down to the acquisition side and persistent. My thing has always been persistent presence. I have to do it to maintain my business. Most people have to do it to maintain their business. And it's just being in the right room at the right time, because sometimes you never know. If you're in that spot, something happens, that right person comes along, and then next thing you know, you're under contract.
And the only thing I would just add to that wonderful articulated series of statements is that yes, the technology absolutely matters. That actually gets you in the door. Yet it's the relationships will carry you across the finish line. And building those relationships and actually having people be force multipliers for you, whether they're systems integrators or great, sages like John, having them on your side is going to open up a tremendous amount of doors, because you can't be everywhere all the time. And so actually having people that can actually be your advocates is probably the best way forward. So
Agree. And we really appreciate your time, John. And along with this information in this series, in this episode, there's others as well. So if anybody does want to go back and watch previous episodes, everything is echoed across all of them. And I think the best version is every time we have one, we have a little bit of new insight, which is excellent. And if ever you wanted to meet some of these people from the States who can connect you in, Revelli is an event that we're hosting in September on the Gold Coast. The tickets are currently live. If you go to Beaton Zone Venture Partners website, you can come along to that event and plug into the ecosystem directly here based in Australia. If not, if you're haven't got any plans to travel overseas in the near future, that's probably a great place to start. And we're trying to lure John over as well. So he hasn't confirmed yet. But thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone got some value, and the recording will be up by the end of the day. So thank you.
Awesome.
thank
Thank
you,
you.
John. Thank you, Peter.
My pleasure.